Chapter 21. Mage Fire. Now Gabriella and Adamantis could follow the line of X's that Mortimer had left behind. Gabriella briefly thought about the creature following them before they reached the treasure house, hoping it had been scared away by the noise and commotion. Wherever it was, she felt no more fear of it. She had run out of emotion. She was numb. It could have leapt out at her with 8 eyes and razor claws. Wary as she was, she doubted she would flinch. They reached the entrance chamber, Adamantis still limping, when Gabriella saw the twisted and crushed door. She felt grateful to the mother wyvern, and then she burned with shame. She could not bring herself to find the broken egg. 2 wild creatures of terrible beauty, mother and offspring, were now gone because of her. She and Adamantis slipped out through the destroyed doors, which glowed with heat left from the mother's fire. The air shimmered like the outside of a kiln. All the shrubs on the outside of the entrance had been burned to nothingness. Rocks were blackened and melted. The mother wyvern was nowhere in sight. She must have been trapped in the collapsing treasure house. Gabriella thought. At least, in death, buried beneath the rubble, the dragon would be released from her sadness. Too many had suffered as a result of this trip, she reflected. She just wanted to go home. They shuffled along the edge to the cliff. To her relief, Gabriella found Dameon waiting near the Elan. He was leaning against the tree that the ship was moored to, his hand resting on the line. Upon seeing Gabriella, he grabbed the edge of her shirt, but he did not know what to do next. He kept his eyes focused on the empty space behind her. He shook his hand anxiously, tapping Gabriella through her clothing. It was the closest she would come to getting a hug from her brother. "I'm glad to see you too, Dameon. Where's Mortimer?" Dameon pointed to the Elan. The decks were crowded with trunks and bags of treasure. The rectangular trunks on the port and starboard decks reached as high, even higher, than the mid-deck. Narrow pathways snaked between the walls of loot. But Gabriella knew it would still be impossible to maneuver about the decks to properly handle the rigging. Mortimer, with limited sailing experience, would not know this. Squeezed between piles of coins piled on the port deck, he was trying to push the heavy sacks against the gunwale to make more room. The boards beneath his feet groaned with strain. Gabriella feared the whole ship might break apart. She crossed the gangway, Adamantis and Dameon behind her, and faced Mortimer. "What are you doing?" He looked up from the bags. "Mr. Creedley, we are leaving." "I doubt that," he began to say. "Sybil and Lippis are dead. So is the mother wyvern. The treasure house has been destroyed with the wyvern and the princesses inside of it." "What?" Mortimer said, his eyes wide, his jaw slack. Gabriella explained what had happened. She knew he believed her. If the sisters or the wyvern were still alive, she would have been in greater hurry to escape. But she took her time answering his questions, not wavering from her main point. They were going back. "But we can sift through the rubble, find the wands," Mortimer said. "They are better lost," Adamantis said. Mortimer's eyes moved toward the gangway, then back to the 3 of them. His hand drifted down towards his belt of knives. "Don't think about it, Mortimer," Gabriella said. Her use of his first name surprised even her, but something had changed between them. "And spare me your supplications. I don't trust you. I don't like you, but I recognize that you might be different than Sybil. She had nothing but good things happen to her, and she chose to be bad. She was bad through and through. You had bad things happen to you, but now you can choose better. I know you can. You can choose not to try to stop us. You can choose to help us again. I'll even give you this." Gabriella dug into her pocket. The gems clicked against one another. She took one in her fist and held it out to Mortimer. It was the green stone. Thalix. Mortimer was transformed by the sight of the gem. His face reflected the greenish light of the emerald. Even his eyes took on a jade hue. His hands were trembling. "It's yours," Gabriella said. "If only—" She did not finish her sentence. He rushed her, one hand spreading wide for the stone, the other wielding a knife. Gabriella let go of the stone and stepped back. The abrupt shifting of weight was too much for the overburdened deck. The planking below them collapsed, the stacks of trunks tipped, and their contents rattling and spilling out in a golden rain. "No!" Mortimer cried as bags of the gold fell away. He clung to the lip of the mid-deck, his feet pressed against a single plank that had not dropped away. A rift yawned open in the boards, moving toward the bow, clearing the deck. A set of chests tumbled into the abyss. The next to them teetered Dameon. The drop to the ground below was dizzying. For a moment, Gabriella struggled with the return of her vertigo. Her hands felt clammy with fear, her armpits wet. Dameon waved his hands to regain balance, but it was clear he was falling forward, following the chest. Mortimer was too far away to save him. So was Adamantis, but she was not, and nothing else mattered. Before she could think, she took 2 running steps, flung herself over the gap in the floorboards, and shoved Dameon away. He fell backwards onto his tailbone, crying out in pain, but he was safe. "Gabriella!" Adamantis called out. She struck the splintering planks face first. The impact dazed her, but she struggled to focus and grab hold of an exposed joist before she slipped over the edge. She felt warm blood on her face. Her weight was bending the weakened boards she clutched. Snaps and pops ran through the length of the wood. She dared not move. Below her, the broken pieces of the Elan flipped end over end along the sheer face towards the valley floor. The trunks spun, sending their contents out in golden clouds. Adamantis and Dameon were frozen, like witnesses to someone who had fallen through thin ice. Adamantis stepped forward, but the boards all around creaked. "Stop! Don't come closer," she said. "Dameon, get a rope," Adamantis said over his shoulder. "Hold on, Gabriella." Mortimer shifted and squirmed, the fabric of his clothes rubbing up against the mid-deck wall. His face was twisted as he strained to reach Follick's jewel resting just out of his reach on the edge of the gaping hole in the deck. But he had also moved closer to Gabriella. She was within his reach. "Mr. Creedley, Mortimer, please help," she said, her voice small. Mortimer made no immediate acknowledgement, no recognition of her plea. Gabriella realized he was calculating. "It's the emerald or me," she thought. She knew she should have been filled with anger at his hesitation, but she was too scared, too vulnerable right then. She could only plead. She and Mortimer had been companions, partners, unwilling, but partners nonetheless. She wanted to say all these things, but all that came out was, "We're both Harkonites, Mortimer." The greed left his face, and for a moment, perhaps for the first time since Gabriella had known Mortimer Creedley, his face was candid and open. Gabriella could see the young boy who had so valiantly tried to save his family, who had knelt on the capsized boat, the sound of lapping waves and pounding hands filling his ears, as he tried fruitlessly to peel back the boards that sealed his family in a watery tomb. She could see a Mortimer Creedley who had yet to close his heart to others. She saw the Mortimer Creedley who had leapt into cold rushing water to save her brother, the same man who had brazenly challenged the wyvern on the deck of the Elan. In a soft voice he said, "You are right, Gabriella." Mortimer reached for her, but it was too late. The boards beneath him could not support his weight and began to give. As he slipped, Mortimer grabbed for a floorboard in the mid-deck. It broke off in his hand. Follick's jewel spun up into the air. It hovered, a small moon orbiting Mortimer's head. With his last effort, he reached not for the edge of the deck to stop his fall, but for the jewel. Both tumbled out of sight. As he fell, the sprig of Nyma's flowers that he had fixed to his buttonhole flew free and floated like a feather. Crushed and wilted, it danced on the breeze as if it had a life of its own. The tiny bouquet took much more time to fall through the hole where Mortimer disappeared. For a moment, the flowers lingered on the edge of the hole, then slipped off to follow Mortimer. It took a long while for the sound of the impact to reach them. All of them, even Dameon, stared, shocked, wide-eyed, at the empty space on the deck. Gabriella kept waiting for Mortimer to reappear, to heroically pull himself back up. It felt impossible for him to be gone, but the echo of the impact told her otherwise. When she shifted her weight, she saw the stolen goat's skull staring back at her from the mid-deck, its jewels glittering like stars aligned in the heavens, with all the certainty of a curse come true. She turned her face from those hollowed eyes to see Adamantis and Dameon searching for extra line, but the trunks of treasure were in their way. Exasperated, Adamantis kicked one box overboard and heaved 2 others after it with his antlers. Dameon wailed a low panicked howl that grew to a frustrated scream as he found a rope but could not dislodge it from beneath the treasure chest. Gabriella's joy sagged downward. She knew she should wait, but panic gripped her. She tried to pull herself up. The additional pressure was just enough. The wood snapped. Gabriella fell. She knew it was a long way down. She tumbled out of control, watching the sea, the land, the clouds, the ever-shrinking Elan, and the sky visible through its traitorous hole. Out in the harbor, she saw black clouds filling the air, as if a war party had just burned this, as if the sylphs had finally found them. Even if those demons had, Gabriella had escaped. Beyond those dark clouds, the sea was red, the sky was pink. Gabriella had the last glimpse of beauty before the opposite cliff face came up and blocked her view. Now the steel blue of the harbor spread before her. She was reminded how before this view had made her dizzy and ill to look upon from the cliff. She now understood why. It was not just vertigo. It was premonition. Her horizon continued to shrink. Her body in the falling air was still accelerating, as if she were riding Adamantus at his swiftest. She realized she would miss her dear friend. The bottom of the cliff grew closer. She saw the ground in frightening detail. The wind was such a growing roar in her ears that she was sure she was completely deaf. She clenched her eyes shut. She did not want to see Mortimer's shattered body on the rocks, smashed and broken the way she soon would be. She wanted to remember the pink clouds, the red sun, the blue bay, the autumn leaves bending over the sleepy ruins. She braced for the final impact. She hoped it was quick. "I'm sorry, Mother." It was not instantaneous. The pain struck her in her upper body first. She pictured her arms being torn from her shoulders, her head rolling forward, her legs splaying outwards, the blood rushing to them so that she felt her feet would burst. The feeling of deceleration was not immediate either. Strangely, it was drawn out, as if miraculously by her own wishing, she was slowing just before she touched the earth. She wondered if this was that long moment just before the end, when time slowed and her whole life played out. Curiosity, fear, confusion forced her eyes open. Death was right before her, and the misshapen form of Mortimer. His head was hidden between rocks, his legs clearly broken with one twisted backward at the knee. A few bones, pushed out by the force of impact, had split the skin of his neck. One arm was mangled beneath him, the other stretched outward, as if even in death he was reaching for the emerald that had landed in a patch of gravel just out of his reach. Gabriella was next, but she was perplexed by this experience of death. The slowness of it. She did not see her own body below her. She thought she could still hear her heart beating powerfully in her ears, so much so that it made the air tremble around her, rhythmically, as when an albatross took wing. Something screeched, like a bird of prey, like something unnamed. Gabriella had heard it before in the caverns. At that moment, she knew what the creature in the caverns had been. Death, stalking them. It had known her time, and Mortimer's time, and the princess's time. All had been running short. But death had a strange, uneven flight. Gabriella wobbled back and forth, worried she might even strike the cliff face. Mortimer's body diminished. She was flying upwards. Was Mortimer experiencing the same flight now, and his own perception? Was he being lifted up by another such ghoul come from the underworld? And if she were going to the underworld, why move upwards? The ruins, the harbor, the sea, the sky came into view once more. They all looked the same in death as in life. Gabriella felt a tremor of fear to be returned to such a height. With her fear came the realization that she was not dead. She was floating, flying even, but not dead. She tried to reach up an arm but could not move it for the pressure on her shoulder. She could not even turn her head, but there was something holding her, something biting her. Hot blood ran down her sides. She could see it spilling into her shirt. She was bleeding profusely, but she was not dead. The ground grew distant again. That vertiginous view returned. Would she be dropped? What would this bird, this creature that had snared her, do? The path of their flight took them higher than the cliff. Solid ground appeared just beyond the reach of her feet, then was gone again. Treetops swayed under her toes. A silvery river twisted between hills below. A seahawk passed, its wings spread wide, feathers translucent in the setting sun. Then, the Elan finally slipped beneath her where Adamantus and Dameon stared at her with astonished faces. With a new flurry of wing flaps, Gabriella slowed and was deposited on mid-deck. It was not until her limbs were folded beneath her on the deck that she felt release from the pressure and the pain. Dameon seized her, balling her sleeve at his fist. "You all right?" It was part question, part statement, his breath coming in quick pants. "Yeah," She croaked, blood trickling down her arms in rivulets. It felt as if knives had gouged her back. The creature landing on the railing. It was not a bird, but it was not unfamiliar. The bat-like wings, the rows of teeth, the brilliant blue scales, like a spring sky. Gabriella's mind fumbled for an answer until the miniature wyvern let out a cry and lowered its face to hers. The cracked egg. The hatched baby. "Hello there," she said, at a loss for any other words, and too scared to make any sudden moves around this animal whose talons were marked with her blood. Dameon returned from the cabin and pressed cloth bandages around Gabriella. "Thanks," she said, touched by his thoughtfulness. At the sound of Gabriella's voice, the baby wyvern leapt off the railing to the deck and pressed his snout to her chest. The creature was scaly and tough, hardly cuddly. Its snout was actually painful pressed against her body. It was like embracing a suit of armor. She tried pushing it away, but the young wyvern was like a friendly pup, and much like a puppy, it seemed unaware of its size, shape, or strength. Finally, they seemed to wordlessly agree on a happy medium. It remained a comfortable distance from Gabriella, as long as her hand remained on his head or neck. "He must have followed your voice through the maze," Adamantis said. "I never would have imagined." "Nor myself. I thought I was lost." Her hands, where they lay on the muscular neck of the wyvern, were still shaking. Suddenly, she began to sob. Adamantis pressed himself against her. She went to hold his head in her arms, but the wyvern quickly intervened, jealous. It caused her to laugh and broke her out of her tears. "Let's get out of here. Let's go home." They moved some of the trunks into the bow, and a few they simply tossed overboard, Gabriella managing as best as she could with her wounds. They had more treasure than Gabriella had ever imagined they would need. Once the sails were set, she wrapped Dameon on the softest blanket they had and rubbed ointment on his wounds. She treated Adamantis and saw to her own injuries. Then sat her brother next to her in the wheel well. Adamantis placed himself beside them. Gabriella spun the wheel. The baby wyvern squawked, danced along the railing, and took short flights along the ship. Weighted heavily. The Elan responded slowly, but soon was headed into the west. She sighed with relief as she watched the growing space between the Elan and the cliff edge. The ruined doors shrank to the size of normal doors, then dollhouse-sized doors, and soon they disappeared. The moss-covered ruins of Dis passed below them. Gabriella contemplated the millions they had on board and wondered if they should dump a few more chests in order to increase their speed. They were already hopelessly late to pay off Mab Miller. A new doubtful voice spoke within her, echoing Mortimer's words. Was it even worth it? Was her faith in the dead and the importance of the tower misplaced anyway? She knew she would have time to talk to Adamantis about her confusion on the return voyage. For now she wanted to savor the sunset, thankful she was still alive to enjoy it. The ship rounded the final cliff at the edge of the harbor. She prepared herself for pink mountains of clouds. But night awaited them. Black, oily clouds spread like a net to capture the Elan. Gabriella knew what they were before the ship even touched the edges of these dark masses. She knew from the clammy fear that seized her body, by the sudden rush of fatigue that enveloped her. The sylphs. Those demons of the air she had accidentally released from their prison on Harkness. They had swelled to prodigious proportions. It had made sense to her. Perfect sense. Hadn't Omanuju said that they had thrived off the fear of living beings? All this time they had followed and fed on the fears of the shipmates. The sylphs had hunted that easy scent like sharks followed blood, but they had waited until the wyvern was dead. Now that the sylphs had grown so strong, they would overcome any resistance the four of them could mount. Each sylph was the size of many houses now. Their wavering forms expanded before her eyes. Gabriella could see a closing channel between them, but it was no use to try to pilot the Elan through. They would never survive. She made an attempt to turn the ship, but as soon as she touched the wheel, she was sapped of strength. Adamantis collapsed beside her, the bandages rolling off his wounds. She used her last bit of effort to touch his fur with one hand, and then touched Dameon's hand. She would not die bereft of the touch of others. Dameon's skin was wet and clammy with fear. Gabriella's eyesight was fading. Beyond her brother's slumping figure, the baby wyvern had landed on the mid-deck. It shook its wings and screeched. By its gasps and coughs, Gabriella knew it was attempting to breathe fire. But it was yet too young. She wanted to tell it to flee, but she was too weak. At least one should escape, she thought. Larger feet, identical to those of the baby wyvern, except they were copper-colored, landed on the foredeck. The ship shuddered. Gabriella felt a strong breeze on her face. Boards splintered as the wood gave little resistance to the massive talons. The Elan lurched to a stop. The sail bellied out in reverse. The black clouds of the sylphs shifted, repelled. A familiar smell struck Gabriella, that of dust and debris from the treasure house mixed with smoke and the scent of charred flesh. The feet, with familiar broken talons, pushed the Elan like a toy. Gabriella slumped forward as the ship jerked backwards. A second shadow of the mother wyvern's wings blocked out the sun. Dust from the collapsed treasure house floated down with each stroke of her wings. She released the Elan and repositioned herself, taking the ship by the stern. She flapped her wings. Her offspring still squawked fiercely from the middeck. The black clouds moved in once more. The mother wyvern's chest expanded. Air rushed in through her mouth and nostrils. Gabriella knew what was coming. The fire rippled forth across the Elan. The baby wyvern howled. Gabriella cowered. But like her fall down the cliff, it was not what she expected. There was no scorching heat, only a pleasurable tingling sensation, like feathers across her body. She felt warmth returning to her limbs, moving in waves through her body to her head, and to a point just between her eyes. She opened them wider. All three of the Elan's little crew were surrounded in flames. But this fire was not orange or red, but silver, infused with blue and tipped with gold. Adamantus had raised his head as he felt warmth. The color of the flames was the color of his antlers, and his crown disappeared in the onrush of light. Gabriella was reminded of the colors of the stars that she had seen within Gade. It was as if the Elan had swept into a tail of a swiftly moving comet. The dried blood on the elk's chest and leg disappeared. His fur was smoothed and cleaned, so that it was as resplendent as on the first day he and Gabriella met. His eyes grew bright again. Gabriella became aware of how much she loved him. Every inch, every point of his antlers, every hair on his coat. She wanted to be with him the rest of her life. Her hyper-consciousness turned to her brother. She could see inside Dameon, all the parts of his mind that were unique and that would never be like other people's. She could glimpse his abilities like an illuminated subterranean cavern whose depths went on forever. She envied him not, for the only thing greater than his abilities was the love he held for her, his sister, his protector, his best friend. Otherwise locked and hidden away in a mind that could not express it, she could see his love as clearly now as a burning sun in his breast. A tingling sensation on her back told her that her wounds were healing. Her hair, where it had been singed and snagged, grew back before her eyes, even into her eyes, so that she had to brush it away. As the fire continued, the black clouds of sylphs diminished. They cried out in hisses as their substance evaporated in the flames. Mage fire. It was just as Omanujou had described, a creative healing force that gave Gabriella a wider vision, deeper wisdom, even if for a fleeting moment. The wyvern blew her breath of life over the ship longer than any normal breath would have lasted. It came to a gradual end, like a passing rainstorm. When it did, Gabriella felt emptied and filled at once. The sylphs were gone, their substance destroyed. Not a wisp remained. The baby wyvern leapt off the railing and performed a loop over the Elan. Its quick and clumsy movements were a marked contrast to the graceful, ponderous gestures of its mother. She released the Elan. A strong breeze from her wings propelled the ship forward, rocking and tipping top-heavy. The mother swam in the air alongside, dust still trailing off her body. Here and there, a coin was stuck between her scales. Her eye rested on Gabriella. She knew the understanding she had sensed between herself and the dragon had always been genuine. They did not need language to know one another. "What do you want?" the dragon's eye asked. "We want to go home. Harkness," Gabriella said, forming a picture of the island in her mind and holding it there, aware that the wyvern could see it just as if Gabriella held up a picture in her hands. The wyvern flapped her wings and pushed herself forward, just ahead of the bowsprit. She cupped her wings and slowed to the same speed as the Elan. Her tail passed over them, a looming tree limb, then fell across the bow. It sprawled across the deck and wound itself like a snake through the front railing and up into the complex mesh of rigging that suspended the sail. The ship shuddered as it shifted from being pushed by the wind to being pulled by the dragon. The planking and railings creaked. The sails filled backwards. Gabriella ran to the halyard to drop and furl the canvas. The mother approved. She flapped her wings, the wind rose, and the Elan rocked forward. Chapter 22. Harkness. The Elan cut through the sky with speed never equaled by her sails. Air rushed over the deck like a gale. Gabriella's sable hair was flattened across her face. The mage fire had made it long and lustrous. She was forced to tie it into a ponytail just so she could see. Adamantus's fur danced and rippled, and his antlers whistled in the wind, as they had that first day they crossed the grasslands. The mage fire healed the scratches and bruises on Dameon. Gabriella wrapped him in an oversized rain cloak so that he would not catch cold from the draft. The sun was just over the bow, the eastern continent receding behind them. Gabriella scrambled to the middeck, placed her hand on the tail of the wyvern, and spoke. "There is somewhere we must first go." No sooner had she pictured the island of Asan in her mind than the wyvern turned south. The continent, with the long shadows of late afternoon reaching across its hills and dells, passed along the port rail. Gabriella could sense the mother's reluctance to go to the island. There indeed was something about the island that kept dragons at bay. Gabriella considered the goat skull, sitting just inches from the dragon's tail. Looking at it made her skin crawl. She would not try to plumb the mysteries of relics this day. Instead, she joined Adamantus and Dameon on the middeck, taking one last lingering look at the eastern shores. Gabriella guessed they all felt the same way. They must look now because this journey would not be repeated. The Elan reached Vasan with dreamlike speed. The wyvern soared lower over the channel. Waves and white caps passed beneath them with extraordinary swiftness. Now Gabriella knew what it felt like to be the wind. The village came into view. Not a single ship was in the channel. Not a single chimney breathed a puff of smoke. The wyvern slowed, and they circled the buildings. All the prone figures remained on the ground. The island looked as though the plague had struck. When the wyvern pulled the Elan alongside the pillar, her wings kicked up eddies of dusty air. The Visani remained motionless. The Elan was still too high. The gangway would not reach the ground. Understanding this, the wyvern offered her tail to Gabriella and Adamantus, curling it around them gently and carrying them to the ground. As they set foot on the island, no one stirred. Gabriella feared they were too late. Chas was just where she had left him. Gabriella knelt beside him, opening a small cask of water and pouring it into a cup that she placed next to his face. "Chas, please drink. We have returned your relic." Adamantus translated. At first, the old man did not move. Gabriella wondered again if she were truly standing in one great graveyard. Then Chas lifted his head. The old man looked at the pillar just as Dameon replaced the skull, handling the relic with a delicate touch. Then Chas saw the wyvern. Gabriella did not even try to explain. Adamantus spoke quickly in soothing tones, but it took a long time for the panic to subside from Chas's face. It was replaced by bemused wonder, which only increased when the baby wyvern landed beside them and sniffed Chas's hand the way a dog might. Gabriella encouraged Chas to pet the creature. He did so, then laughed aloud, incredulous. The laughter caused others to look up. Like Chas, they first panicked, but the old leader calmed them, calling out in a hoarse voice and gesturing to Gabriella. "What is he saying?" Gabriella asked Adamantus. "That you left a prisoner but returned a dragon lord. You are most wondrous. You have tamed dragons, returned the relic, and saved the city." "Don't tell the wyvern that tame part. For some reason, I don't think she would like it." At Gabriella's signal, Dameon pushed 5 trunks through the gap of the port deck. They dropped onto the town square and spilled their contents. The people gasped. Dameon bounced on the balls of his feet with pleasure as the coins spread sparkling below him. Then his smile faded, replaced by a look of concentration as he began to count the coins. Gabriella touched Chas on the shoulder. "Payment," she said, "for your hospitality, supplies, and troubles." Gabriella was pleased to see Jambi and Naima pick themselves up from the ground, offering shy smiles. As Gabriella and Adamantus were enveloped by the wyvern's tail again, Chas came alongside, touched his breast, and spoke. "He promises that they will honor you," Adamantus said. Then Chas added something under his breath that made the elk's eye light up with merriment. "What was that?" Gabriella asked. The mother's tail was already curling up, lifting them back into the elan. "He says that they will be arguing for years whether or not the relic still works after having a dragon alight on the island. It will give the old men something to debate about." Gabriella blew Chas a kiss. The wyvern wrapped her tail around the ship once more. As she flapped her wings, whirlwinds of dust twisted through the crowds of people. They shielded their faces, but no one turned away. No one could avert their eyes from the graceful, glistening beast. Chas, Jambi, and Naima waved with both hands raised high above their heads. Gabriella waved back and even shook Dameon's arm towards them until the three Vaisani were too small to distinguish. The elan in tow was a transformed experience. The wind was constantly howling. Sometimes if they encountered a gust that hit the ship broadside or worse, on the prow, the deck would heave or drop suddenly, sending trunks and their contents jiggling. Lighting a fire was near impossible until they created a windbreak with a treasure chest at the stern. On their first visit to Vaisan, the people had packed them ample flatbread, salted meat, as well as yellow-green apples, unlike the red apples familiar to Gabriella. She found jars of peanuts as well as boiled eggs. She dragged over a bag of oats from one of the compartments for Adamantis to feast upon. The Vaisani had seen to everyone's needs. No one need grow hungry. They had enough food for a return journey of many weeks. But weeks were not needed. Adamantis estimated that at their present speed, they would reach Harkness in just 4 hours. Gabriella checked and double-checked with Dameon how much time had elapsed since they had left Harkness. It was unbelievable to Gabriella, but she imagined they just might reach Harkness before the new moon. Feathers returned to her stomach. That night, Gabriella waited anxiously at the stern for the waning moon to rise. It was nothing but a sliver. In a day or two, it would be gone altogether. Adamantis and Dameon were confident of each other's estimations. All there was left to do was wait and hope. At night, they all huddled together, wrapped in blankets to keep out the cold. Even the baby wyvern could not keep up with his mother's pace, so oftentimes he rested with them. They slept on mattresses dragged on the deck within the shelter of their windbreak. No one wanted to sleep within the cabins, not when the moonlight was dim and the stars scattered from horizon to horizon were so bright that they hovered within the touch of an outstretched hand, not when they knew their trip sailing together in the heavens would soon end. They passed Foyle Island on a sunny afternoon. Its shape was clearly visible over the sea, but a blue haze obscured the island like a pall of sadness. Fortunately, the mother did not fly close. After a time, Gabriella could not bear to look at the place. She tracked its position by the reflection in Adamantis's eyes while she rolled the sprig with the blue leaves between her fingers and moistened the cloth around it. The wind continued to roar over the deck. The rigging hummed and stretched the frames of the sails. When she needed a change or a distraction, Gabriella made her way to the bow, where she sat wrapped in a cloak, listening carefully to the groans of the old ship. But most of all, watching the sea and the sky go by, often with Gayday's leaves in her hands. During her interludes alone on the prow, she thought of Omanuju. She also thought of Mortimer. For Omanuju, she felt pure sadness, but her feelings about Mortimer, his courage, his betrayal, and his death were too complex to put into words. She had not spoken of him to either Adamantis or Dameon. She mourned Omanuju. She even mourned Mortimer a bit, but she was not certain whether she mourned the man who was, or the man that he could have been. As the elan pressed westward, ever closer to home, she could not shake the feeling that they had left too many Harkonites, friend or no, behind. Clouds passed, scattered clouds like spilled cream, blotted clouds like droppings from cotton sacks, mountain ranges of clouds that were painted the colors of the sunset, oranges, reds, purples, blues, menacing clouds that hung, black as anvils, cracked apart by lightning, all while the sun rolled through the dome of the sky, from one horizon to the next. The sea sometimes took on the sun's color, sometimes the sky's, sometimes its own moody, brooding gray flecked with white, like an aging man's hair. Gabriella saw sets of islands she recognized from their travels. She passed the sulfuric-smelling fumaroles, those rents in the earth where gases hotter than a summer day poured forth. They flew over the islands where thousands of puffins and pelicans roosted, where no person had ever set foot. Gabriella thought of how she had changed since the first glimpsing of the islands far below on their outward journey. Back then, the height had been a sickening curse, the ship a confusing mystery to her. She had been a complete mystery to herself. Now she was skipper, her vertigo for the most part gone, and she knew herself better. She knew how strong she could be. Gabriella remembered feeling that these rocky shores were so far from home, so distant and desolate. Now, ironically, they seemed close, a sign of nearing their destination. Passing Kajil was like passing a neighbor's house. Gabriella thought of the outfit she had made for herself on the island. The look in Gade's eye when he saw her in it, the feeling of power she had experienced wearing it. As the leagues passed, the Elan shook and shuddered. These speeds, these winds, and these miles had not been kind to the airship. The Elan was like a wife yearning for her past husband, but Gade was long gone. In his absence, the Elan deteriorated, the widow withered. Dameon had counted 27 pieces of the hull that had broken free in the wind since they had left Vaison. At such a speed, the boards would snap free and clatter along the hull, sucked into their ship's stream, announcing another breach before soaring out behind the ship into the empty sky. The chamber enclosing the magnetic stone was riddled with sunlight, pouring in through the fresh holes in the hull. The ropes wrapped around the axles, holding the stone, had long since lost their tautness and hung loose. They were so frayed, Gabriella did not even consider trying to tighten them for fear of snapping them. The metal vices Mortimer had fixed were already corroding. The gaps in the axle beams were 3 fingers wide now. All the rigging had begun to crumble in her hands. She prayed to whom she no longer knew, but she prayed they would hold together. On the last day of their journey, by their best estimates, they would reach Harkness at day's end. Dameon, Adamantis, and Gabriella gathered in the stern. They sat in silence. Gabriella wondered why she felt no excitement or relief, being so near her home island, but a sense of loss instead. She would miss the closeness to Adamantis and her brother that their adventures had fostered. She would also miss the sense of discovery that every day it brought. She knew they had to return home, but she was already wondering when she might broach the subject of trying to repair one of the remaining airships for future trips with Adamantis. The notion helped to ease her melancholy. Even the baby wyvern was morose, sensing that a farewell was imminent. The parting came in the late afternoon, when the mother wyvern called out from the bow in a gentle trumpeting roar to her offspring. The wind was dying around the ship. The dragon's tail had gone slack and was sliding over the railing, a retreating snake. Harkness, wreathed in white surf, waited below. They had reached the eastern, unpopulated side of the island. Gabriella could see the cove where they had first found the Elan, to the north. Long shadows of leafless trees stretched across the island's slopes. Some valleys were already lost in the shade of evening. An entire moon had passed. Days had grown darker. Autumn was fading into winter. A night mist rolled toward the hilltops. For Gabriella, it was strange to see the island, not because it had changed, but rather because it had not. So many things had changed within her. She had half expected her home to have adapted to reflect it. But the island moved to a much different time, the same slow movement that had turned this into forested ruins. In her short life, she knew Harkness would remain constant, steady, eternal. The baby wyvern nudged her. Gabriella rubbed its scaly face a moment before it leapt over the rail, to fly beside its mother, who stroked her wings at a more leisurely pace now. Her offspring was nervous and bobbing dragonfly beside her. With a final and loud gust of air from her nostrils, the mother who had been their enemy, their champion, and finally their savior, twisted in the air and swept over the Elan, waving her wings in a dramatic swoosh, so that one last blast of air rocked Gabriella, Dameon, and Adamantis like an affectionate caress. Then the 2 dragons flew off into the east, where the evening star was visible. Gabriella raised the sail and caught a strong breeze. It was a gentle wind that blew inland as each day turned into night on Harkness. She recalled how her family had adjusted the windows of their home to the breeze, depending on the time of year. She planned for the Elan to ride the breeze over the highlands of the island and land at the edge of the forest in a well-hidden dell. Adamantis could carry them, as well as a trunk, to the edge of town, and then Gabriella and Dameon would take the trunk to Chief Salinger's house from there. Damien's finger tapped out a rhythm on the railing beside him. She could tell he was pleased that they were returning home. He asked Gabriella if she thought Mother would fix his favorite meal, or fried chicken, or if she would scold them. Likely both, Gabriella said, smiling. She felt relieved at the thought of a meal with her parents, but it was bittersweet, for it would mean a meal without Adamantis. After all they had been through, she knew she wanted to have him in her life more than ever, and she was loath to spend even a single night without him. She fantasized about building a cottage in the Highlands where she could stay part of the year with Dameon and Adamantis. She turned to the elk. Adamantis, I know you are without Omanuju now, but I hope we can be friends forever. I would like that. A loud snap followed by a lurch cut the elk short. Gabriella screamed for Dameon to hold on. The paneled sail tilted, and the canvas went slack. With a terrible groan, the Elan began to tilt downward. Trunks of treasure tumbled forward. The middeck rose alarmingly. Planks splintered and cracked, as if a whale were trying to surface beneath them. The ship began to slide sideways. "It's the stone!" Gabriella yelled. "The axles have given way!" As she spoke, the ship tilted again. The black surface of the stone became visible through the breaks in the wood. "What do we do?" she asked, breathless. "The stone will keep pressing upwards until it is free. The boards will not hold it. We must land," Adamantis said, searching over the side. "How?" The elk looked to the levers in the wheel well. Gabriella knew there was no other way. "Dameon," she said, "come over to Adamantis' side." As Gade had done for her, she strapped Dameon into the Cygnus seating. There was no time for Adamantis to secure himself in the cabin, so she buckled him across two of the folding seats. She threw herself into the chair behind the wheel. She yanked the leather lap straps across her thighs and pulled them extra tight. She had spent hours in the seat working with the wheel, but had never needed to touch the pedals that worked the side rails. She knew she would have to reach them now. The stone shifted again. The slivers of the planks popped out and danced across the deck. The ship's forward momentum had all but disappeared. They were simply floating, crippled. "It's best just to release the stone." Adamantis tossed his head. "If we just sit here, there is no telling how much of the deck it will take with it." "Which lever?" Gabriella cried. But then she realized she already knew. The black one, the one with the head carved like a skull. The one that, when she had pulled it halfway down before, had flipped the stone. "The black one! Pull it all the way back!" She locked both hands around the lever and yanked downward. It came surprisingly easily, then stopped where the groove cut to the right. There was no turning back. She heaved it left, then down again. This time it took all her strength. Just when she was beginning to think, it was jammed. It dropped into place. Something beneath the middeck popped. Hinges squeaked, and the middeck of the Elan opened up. The stone floated upwards like an emancipated storm cloud. The Elan plummeted as if dropped off a hook. No more levitation, no more stone. "The sail! The sail!" Adamantis cried over the rush of air. Gabriella's hair was in her face again. She reached blindly for levers, trying to remember which ones did what, and pulled one. Nothing. She pulled another, and with a swinging of booms, a rolling of wheels, and snap of canvas, the sail slid sideways into a wing overhead. The Elan righted itself and glided smoothly, silently over the forest. The sea was just ahead of them. "You will have to steer us, or we will land in the sea, and we know the ship is not seaworthy," the elk said, twisting in his straps, the whistle from his antlers rising in pitch as they accelerated. Gabriella wished the wyvern had not left them so soon. They were still descending. Adamantis was right. At their present course, they would miss the island completely and crash down in the sea to the south. She pushed a pedal. The ship veered to the port. That was east. They needed to go west. She pressed the other pedal. The ship turned a few degrees to starboard. She released the other pedal, and the Elan gave itself over to the western turn completely. The forest rushed into view. She could make out the familiar contours of the island she knew, even the fields of farmers that lived the furthest from town. The woods would be her first choice of landing spots. The tree branches and pine needles might cushion their descent, and the trees would hide the ship and the treasure. but the Elan was dropping too rapidly. She searched the land below for alternative places, but the fields passed beneath them too quickly. Gabriella experimented with pulling back the wing, which decreased their descent, but also increased their speed. The wind rose to a roar around them. Adamantis was saying something. She stretched the wing again. "You will have to descend more quickly. We won't have a chance to turn back." The elk had read their trajectory better than she had. They would be lucky not to overshoot the length of the entire island, and there would be no circling around. Then she saw the harbor and the village come into view. The glowing houses were the very picture of welcome. The town square was alight with torches, almost as if it was festival time. Had they been gone so long that it was already the harvest festival? Her mind raced to recalculate the dates before being distracted by the need to adjust their speed and their altitude. "Do you think we can reach the town?" she asked Adamantis. "In the dark, it may now be our best course," he said. It would not be the inconspicuous landing Gabriella hoped for, but at least, if they were in town, they could find Chief Salinger's house quickly, and perhaps he could send men to protect the treasure and the ship. Surviving had become paramount to secrecy. She checked their course. They were drifting too far to the north. She swung the ship left, southwards. It was too abrupt, she realized. Soon, they were heading directly towards the sea again, towards deep water. No, no, no. A cacophony of snaps at the starboard railing drew her attention. The ship lurched again. Could nothing go right? The rigging that held the starboard end of the wing was breaking, lines snapping like strings on a fiddle. The eye bolts where the lines connected to the ship were coming loose and pulling wood free alongside them. Old dried caulking fluttered up from the spreading planks and spun in the air like autumn leaves. "Please, just a bit further." She eased the starboard pedal to bring them closer to land again. She winced as she did so, for she knew she was putting pressure on the crumbling side of the ship. She made sure the turn was slow and shallow, keeping them over the water longer than she would have liked. Soon, the island was beneath them again. The ground was closer now, houses passed below. She imagined they must have appeared to be a great dragon swooping over the treetops to anyone on the ground. By the road and the barns below, she could tell they had already passed their own farm. The town was just ahead. She sensed they were going to crash into the mass of buildings. She told herself that she was a fool to have aimed for the town. Unless she landed in the square, the place was a maze of walls and houses. There was no room for error. She pressed the port pedal. They soared over the harbor. It would buy her more time. The ship continued to descend. She was a bit high, but better that than too low. The air above the water was colder. Figures carried torches. The crowds of people filled the square. The whole town was out. It suddenly occurred to her that they could not see her coming. Why would they? Who expects a flying boat to drop out of the night sky? "Watch out!" she screamed, but her voice was lost in the wind. She screeched again, only to have her voice crack. Dameon covered his ears and beat his head against the back of his chair. Adamantis strained against his straps and lifted his head to the sky, like a wolf howling at the moon. A deep baritone moan rose from deep within him, so deep that, like a large drum, its note reverberated in Gabriella's breast. Faces in the square turned their way. At first, there was no reaction, except the opposite of what was most urgently needed. People gathered at the harbor's edge to see what the noise was. Adamantis howled louder, an arm pointed. A scream. A chorus of shouting, and the crowd surged apart. Gabriella tightened her grip on the levers. "Thank the stars! You have a singing voice. They see us." "Good. Now slow us." She tried. Their speed was tremendous. Every movement Gabriella made was too extreme, tilting the ship too far port or too far starboard. The landing called for finesse. They straightened but lost more altitude than she had intended. They were over the docks now. They were too low. They smashed into the naked mast of moored ships. Crow's nests crashed over the railings and splintered against treasure chests. The port wing ripped, the sound of the canvas splittering reverberating. Gabriella pushed both wings to full extension. The ship shuddered and trunk slid forward. The Elan was going into a spin, but Gabriella clipped the wings, her own arms feeling heavy with the force of the rotation against her. The town square was just under the bowsprit. The Elan was skidding through the brightly lit square. No faces were visible now, only their retreating backs of people. The Elan's speed diminished. The sound of wood scraping on stone diminished. A building loomed up in their path. There was no stopping now. Gabriella braced herself. Bricks and thatch fell down on the deck as the ship crashed into a building. The Elan shifted once more, tilting over to the starboard side, rocked, then went still. Gabriella imagined the airship breathing her last. Gabriella patted one of the levers affectionately, as Gayday had when landing in Nicomedi's secret workshop, then leaned back, coughing from the dust. They were home. Chapter 23. A bargain. It took longer than Gabriella anticipated for the villagers to approach the ship. She expected a wall of faces peering over the railings, but only a few men with swords drawn came near. "It is a girl," one yelled, "and a boy, and a deer." She did not know any of the men. She wanted to think of some grand way of disembarking, but her mind was numb, her energy spent. She was relieved just to be alive. The murmurs grew among the crowd. The armed men wove their way through the wreckage that the Elan had left in her wake. Gabriella suddenly was aware that she was in the middle of town, and she had to protect Adamantis. "Are both of you all right?" she asked. The elk nodded. He had gone silent as the men approached. Dameon was covered in dust and barely recognizable. Gabriella was seized with a crazy desire to tussle his hair. She stayed her hand, but smiled affectionately at him. "Dameon, jump out first. You will be our emissary." He followed her bidding, unlocking his straps and carefully sliding down the deck. He used an overturned trunk to step over the railing. Although Gabriella could not see them, she heard the surrounding crowd gasp. She leaned against Adamantis. "I will protect you, my friend," she said. "I trust you with my life, especially after that landing. Gayday would be proud." "I don't know if the Elan liked it much," she said, but their discreet conversation was cut short by the crowd below. Expressions of shock still plastered the townspeople's faces, and the men grasping swords seemed ready to use them. "It is safe," she called down to the crowd, gesturing to the elk. "He is tame." Then Gabriella heard a voice that made her heart leap. Her mother, Marissa, calling Dameon's name. Gabriella heard her father's gruff voice as well. With Adamantis beside her, she crossed what was left of the Elan's deck and went to the railing. "Mother! Pa!" Gabriella cried. Her parents came running out of the crowd. They wrapped Dameon in their arms. With the first sight of her mother's face, she knew there would be no scolding. Gabriella wanted to run directly to her parents, but she did not forget Adamantis. She held herself back and waited for the elk. By the time he had extricated his long legs and antlers from the wreck, Gabriella's parents were at her side. She felt she would never breathe again from the force of their embraces. Her mother kissed her face, and soon they were both powdered in white dust that covered Gabriella. "What's going on?" Gabriella asked when they released her. "Why is everyone gathered in the square?" Her mother was in no state to answer. Looking at Adamantis, her father only said, "It is Omanuju's elk, isn't it?" "Yes," Gabriella said. "Where is Omanuju?" A lump caught in Gabriella's throat. "He did not survive." Her father hugged her closer, but her mind was already moving to other things. For the first time, she assessed the crowd. The familiar smells of the village and harbor struck her: salted fish, boat tar, cooking fires, an unctuous smell of lard lanterns, and, of course, the sour hint of garbage floating below the decks. All the scents, fair and foul, were welcome, reminders that she was home. But the people surrounding the Elan were on edge, ready to fight, their fists clenched, their expressions fixed in a spirit of resistance. The crowd had split in two, a few swarthy and unpopular men on one side, and the rest of the island on the other. Gabriella guessed that the thugs were Mab Miller's supporters, threatening the rest of the village. So this was the night, the last night to pay Miller's price. Gabriella was aware that everyone was staring at her and her family now. She released her father from her embrace, straightened her hair, and stepped toward Adamantis to protect him. The crowd was silent. She asked her parents once more, "What is happening here?" "The Sev War have come to buy the land around the tower," her father said. "The village raised enough money, but Mab has tripled its price. We don't have that amount of gold on the entire island, but the Sev War do. Those on this side of the square are voting to strip Mab of his rights to his land. The ones behind Mab say that it would set a dangerous precedent. The whole island is up in arms. We are in turmoil." Her mother wiped the tears from her eyes. "But at least you are back." Gabriella looked at the crowd. She was pleased that more people were assembled against Mab than for him, but there was still a sizable group standing at his side. Taking a second look, she was surprised. Some of his supporters were good people she would not have expected to back him. Rights to land were sacrosanct on Harkness. Even Gabriella understood the gravity of stripping a family of their rights to land. Everyone's rights would be undermined. Who would feel safe anymore? Mab Miller, dressed in velvet robes, seemed to know this and wore a face of arrogant self-satisfaction. He had not worn his medallions. Perhaps it would have seemed ostentatious to wear them while he asked for even more money. Gabriella noticed Chief Salinger stood in the center of the square, and his wife, Melaine, was close by. The village elders, including Tarmek, the former chief, were also nearby. The elders had aligned their support behind Chief Salinger. Gabriella's heart lurched as she spied the dark cloaks of the Sev War. They were gathered at the harbor's edge, the rest of the crowd standing off from them. It was easy to pick out their leader, Sade, in his crimson cloak amid the other black-clad Sev War. As they clustered around him, he was red iris and a black eye. At his feet sat a heavy sack of gold coins. But the Sev War's attention was not on the gold at their feet. Rather, it was focused on Adamantis. Everyone, to a man, stared at him the way a butcher looked upon a prize sow. Adamantis stepped backwards. Gabriella knew she had little time to waste. She was a single girl, but she had the drama of the moment on her side. "Papa," she said, "please watch over the elk. Do not leave his side." Her father was dumbstruck. Like the Sev War, he stared at Adamantis, but his eyes were a mix of wonderment, fear, and remorse. Gabriella could not understand why her father would look shamed and guilty with one side of the elk. "I will," he said. "Papa, promise me." Now he turned to her. "Gabriella, of course I promise. I will guard his life as if it were your own." Since she had just dropped out of the sky, Gabriella calculated that her powers of persuasion were still strong. She grabbed Dameon, her mother releasing him reluctantly, as if he might not return, and went to the shattered bow of the Elan. Dameon bounced alongside, eager to be free of their mother's tight embrace. With his help, Gabriella lifted one of the trunks and lowered it over the side of the ship. A handle in each hand, they lugged it across the square, the crowd parting before them. Normally, such a load would have exhausted both of them, but she could tell that Dameon shared her sense of purpose. His eyes darted about nervously, and his lips moved with unintelligible words, but his head was down, the crown of his head pointing forward, like a bull would point its horns. It was a poise Dameon struck at his most stubborn. Her heart could not have burst with love for him at that moment. Never had they shared such a cause as they did just then. They stopped before Mab Miller. His family gathered around him. They looked up upon Dameon with discomfort as he lifted his head to briefly let his eyes roll past them. It was aggressive for her brother. Gabriella counted a few beats, letting the Miller's family discomfort grow. Then she looked Mab Miller in the face. For once, she knew she would address an adult as an equal. "The terms of Mr. Miller's price were 3 pounds of gold." No one answered. The crowd was still stunned into silence. She spoke again. "Has every cat in the village got every tongue?" No one laughed. Miller mumbled. "Yes, those were the terms, but the price is now tripled." His voice cracked as he spoke. "Yes, the price is now 9 pounds. A steady voice, laced with resentment. It was Chief Salinger. He raised his voice for all to hear as he approached Gabriella and Mab Miller. "That was the arrangement. But Mr. Miller has raised his price. Only the Sev War are able to pay. We are asking for more time, but there is a motion to strip Mab Miller of his right to his land." "Which is out of the question," Miller said. "You have changed the original agreement without notice," Salinger answered back. "You are also acting against the best interests of this island." The old Chief Tarmek spoke up. This was the same argument they were having before the ship crashed into their midst. "How dare you! I have only the best interests of this island in mind," Miller bellowed, his hands flapping at his sides. "Your false beneficence is not fooling anyone," the old chief shouted back. Salinger tried to calm them both, but Gabriella, flushed with impatience, interrupted them all. "Let him raise the price. We will see it and double it if he agrees to it now." Gabriella kicked over the chest. Gold and jewels spilled onto the ground. Dameon hopped up and down. Miller fell to his knees before the hoard of riches. Shocked, Chief Salinger stared with his mouth hanging open. Even Tarmek and the other elders could only move their mouths as if chewing the words they wished to speak. The crowd surged closer and interrupted the murmurs that threatened to drown out any discussion. Salinger came to his senses and cried out to his men-at-arms. "Hold back the crowd. Please, everyone, we must have silence." Reasserting his role as broker, Salinger stepped between Miller and the gold. "It is not yours, unless you agree." "I agree," Miller said, spreading his short fingers out of the ground and reaching for the nearest coin by Salinger's foot. Miller's wife recoiled as her husband scampered after the gold on all fours like a slovenly dog. "It is done then," Salinger said. He could not repress his smile of relief that crossed his face. He turned to the Sevwar, but Sade rushed up and stood nearly nose to nose with the chief. Gabriella felt a sliver of fear. She searched the crowd for Adamantis, relieved to see her father standing sentinel beside him on the ship. Sade was just as Gabriella remembered him from the town meeting before. His unnaturally smooth skin, his eyes narrow, his cheekbones and nose that made him look like a snake. Gabriella was reminded of Phallic standing amid the rubble of the treasure house, his hood spread wide. Sade pretended to ignore Gabriella, but she felt his rage. She had the sense of being in grave danger, as if a battery of arrows was aimed at her and Adamantis. She had to find a way to get the elk out of the village. "Chief Salinger," Sade said with a plying voice, his groveling tone announcing that he was angling for something. "Whatever he wants, it can't be good," Gabriella thought. "Considering that we have sailed all this way for a deal we have now lost, perhaps there is something you can offer in recompense." "Why would I offer you and your kind anything, after all the worry and dissension you have caused me and my fellow people?" Salinger's clear disgust rallied Gabriella. "I'd give you a strong breeze to blow you back to your home, never to return, never to trouble us again, if it were in my power." Trouble Harkness no more. The dead zone prophecy echoed in Gabriella's head like a bell. Her heart skipped a beat. Sade was unfazed by Salinger's affront. His fingers twisted the broken ring that hung around his neck. "Then a trade. We will make you an offer. We will give you just what you request. We will never return. We will never sow dissension into the people of Harkness again." It was an offer even Gabriella would have entertained. Could it be true? Would the prophecy unfold right before her eyes? She felt dizzy with power. Salinger turned to Sade. Now that the Sevwar had the chief's attention, Sade's lips curled with displeasure. "Give us the elk." It was a burning spear driven through Gabriella's heart down through her entire body. She shouted, "No, you can't! He does not belong to you!" Sade ignored her. He was looking directly into Salinger's eyes, focused like a warlock chanting an incantation. Gabriella did not like the way Salinger was hesitating to respond. The chief put his hand up to quiet Gabriella. She held her tongue. He was the chief after all. He would not betray her now. "You Sevwar and your request," Salinger said. "What is your fascination with this elk?" The Sevwar commander was looking directly at her now. The pleasure in his face was obscene. "What is one animal in return for an island of harmony?" Sade asked the chief. "Where's Omanuju?" Salinger asked her. Gabriella swallowed before answering. "He's dead." Salinger placed a hand over his heart. "How?" She did not want to implicate Mortimer or explain the entire journey when Adamantis's life hung in the balance. Instead, she said, "You know he would not want this." "Even for the promise of peace," Sade offered. "Even for the promise that we would never return." Never return. Gabriella felt as if the ground was moving beneath her, as if she stood on the slanting deck of the Elan in a storm. This could not be happening. "It is dear to the girl, though," Salinger said. The girl. She was just the girl now. Gabriella balled her fist and she heard her knuckles crack. The air was rushing out of her. She saw Salinger in a new light, revealed for what he was. Provincial. Limited. He had never sailed beyond the archipelago. He had not faced demons, dragons, nor set eyes on the towers and tombs of civilizations greater than their own. He had not encountered magic or spirits, or entire islands of cursed people, or people with beliefs different from those of Harkness. Gabriella was amazed, ashamed she had ever been so enamored of him. What did Salinger truly know of the world? "He is not yours to trade," Gabriella challenged in poisonous tones. "Do I need to warn you of your place, Gabriella Carlyle?" "Need I remind you, I just bought the Tower lands back for you." Her mother ran up beside her now, begging her to restrain herself. Gabriella turned to Sade. She hated that painted smile, those lips that pressed against one another so that they were pale as forest grubs. I have a dozen other trunks of treasure in the Alon. I will trade them all for the elk. That is indeed a great fortune for a dumb animal. Surely Chief Salinger would prefer such riches to remain here in Harkness. Dumb. Sade had said it and revealed everything. For in that one word, dumb, as in not speaking, he revealed what he knew. He was teasing her. He knew what Adamantus was. Salinger attempted to soften his words with Gabriella. Gabriella, he's just an animal, like a cow or a pig. There are dozens of others you can tame in the woods. He is nothing like those creatures, she shouted, then stopped, fearful that she would confirm something for Sade and the other wicked Sevor. Gabriella, Salinger said, think of the good of the island. Then he added, standing up taller and looking down his nose, I don't want to have to order you. His posturing did not move her. You will have to, and if you do, you will never have my allegiance again. Gabriella would have spat if her mother had not slapped her mouth from the side. The blow surprised Gabriella so much that she fell to the ground. Tears of frustration and embarrassment were blurring her vision. Salinger finished with her, ordered his men to tie up the elk. Gabriella ran towards Adamantus as her mother grabbed at her. Her shirt tore as she wrestled free of her grip. Salinger's men at arms approached Adamantus cautiously, but Gabriella's father stood in their way and raised his sword. He gave no indication of backing down. Instead, he set his feet into a wide stance and prepared to duel. It was Adamantus who suddenly wandered out from behind him. Gabriella thought he would run to the woods, but the elk stopped short. Salinger's men threw ropes over Adamantus's back. He leapt as a startled wild elk might, but soon he let the men make a loop around his neck. Gabriella's father moved to tear away the net the men threw, but Adamantus backed right under it. 3 more men came from behind and grabbed her father's arms. His sword was knocked from his grasp, but he still fought them. His size and strength were too much for them to overcome. He tossed one attacker over his shoulder, another he lifted up and threw at a 3rd man. Only when a larger number, more than 8 men, came at him, did he fall to the ground with a yell of protest. Gabriella pushed through the melee to Adamantus. Dameon followed her. He rushed headlong into the legs of the man holding the rope around the elk. Dameon's tackle caught him off guard and he tumbled over. Her brother struck at him and clawed, howling, spitting, grunting. Run! Gabriella hissed to Adamantus as she tried to untie the knot around his neck. Adamantus bucked and twisted as if trying to escape, but it was a show so he could bring his mouth closer to her ear. It is the only way, he said. The Sevor must not come back for the tower. I will fend for myself. The full weight of his words struck Gabriella, and she collapsed. After so many leagues, so many trials, she was defeated by her own people. Was this how she was repaid for all the danger she had faced? Was this how the people honored Omanushu's sacrifice? The men of Harkness led Adamantus at spear point towards the Sevor. The Sevor elders were radiant, their eyes glowing with triumph, their hands raised over their heads. The scarred man with the tattoos on his scalp, the one who looked so much like Sade that he could have been his brother, appeared among them, a chain and harness dangling from his hands. Gabriella screamed with rage, pounding anyone near her with her fist, twisting her legs to escape the arms that tried to hold her. Her trousers tore against the cobblestones. She cursed the Sevor, and she cursed Chief Salinger. The chief looked away from her, as one would from a child embarrassing her parents. The withering look Salinger's wife shot Gabriella was not lost on her, though. Villagers were staring at her and her family with disdain. His father's battle with the men of Harkness, his sister's screams of rage, and the capture of Adamantus were all too much for Dameon. He drew his legs up to his chest and began to rock. His eyes were shut tight, and he let out a loud wail. Strangers tried to comfort him, but he clawed at them with his fingernails. They did not understand him like Gabriella did. He did not want comforting. She knew he wanted to scream and clamp his eyes shut until he could not hear or see what was unfolding around him. But oddly enough, through the confusion, she heard the same words usually used to describe her brother, now used to describe her. They are both unwell, mad, cursed. Clearly the whole family shares the same malady. Such a tragedy. Both children are ill. Someone tried to force Gabriella to drink a vial of dark liquid. She knocked it away, and listened to the glass shatter with bitter satisfaction. Her mother brought another vial to her mouth. "Please, Gabriella, this will calm you." Something about the pleading sound of her voice reached through Gabriella's rage. She would follow her mother's pleas. At worst, her mother would stop badgering her. At best, perhaps she would come to see things from Gabriella's side. She gulped down the potion but immediately regretted it. It was bitter, and she remembered the taste from her time in the House of Healing. It was for sleep. Her vision already blurring, Gabriella saw Madame Treacle, the medicine woman, hovering at her mother's shoulder. Gabriella knew how powerful her concoctions were. She fought to stand up, to reach down her throat with her fingers to make herself vomit, but her legs gave out beneath her. The last thing she remembered was her knees hitting cobblestones. Chapter 24. The Market Square. The scene was chaos. A destroyed ship, obviously endowed but now ruined, a king's ransom and treasure, angry villagers, and Sade's mark, Miller, on his knees, his eyes aflame with avarice. Sade knew that they did not have enough resources to counter the offer from the girl called Gabriella. It crossed his mind that they could try fighting the Harkonites, but even with the sorcerers and warriors, the Harkonites were too many. The girl, where had she come from? Sade was quickly losing hope of ever assessing the tower and finding out the connections that might hold to their masters, the Kryen. But lo and behold, out of the wreckage stepped a living, breathing treasure, a Stygorn elk. This one did not look as fierce as the ones he had seen years before in the folios on Raven's desk. This one lacked fangs, but the metallic antlers were unmistakable. Sade performed a quick calculation in his mind. The tower was still an unknown quantity. Whether it could offer a route to the Ring of Domain and break the bonds that held their masters were still unanswered questions. But here, before them, stepping right out of the pages of lore, was a link to the past that was without price. A hero among us. Sade moved into action. He signaled the others to close in on the elk while he made his way through the pressing crowd to the chief. Salinger had proven to be a shrewd negotiator, and he enjoyed the support of his people, but no leader could afford lasting strife and disruption. Sade knew Salinger would not turn down an offer that could return harmony to his community. Better even was the fact that Sade's offer, to leave the Harkonites forever, cost him nothing. It was a decision he had come to already, for he was done with the uncouth northerners and their stubborn ways. He had to compete with all the distractions that had endured from the dramatic arrival of the girl and her brother, who appeared to be an imbecile of some sort by the scattered and confused look on his face. But Sade was still a guest and a negotiator, and for that reason, he was able to command a moment of Chief Salinger's attention. Sade sweetened the offer with the addition of the gold meant for Miller. Salinger would have been a fool not to take it. Like the competent leader he was, after some discussion, which would have gone more smoothly if the girl did not keep interrupting, Salinger finally accepted. Moments before, she had been moon-eyed for the chief, but in an instant she challenged him with more fire than even Sade would have reckoned. Sade decided she was too dangerous. She was no orator, but she had already proven articulate and confident, and she still had the force of her entrance on her side. Given enough time, she might turn her people against the deal. He could not have that. He had to leave this backward island with something to show for all their efforts. He readied an enchantment in his mind to drop the girl into a deep feigning spell. But lo and behold, an old medicine woman and the girl's mother forced a drink into her mouth that did the job for him. This development was all they needed to turn the crowd's attention away from the elk, which was resisting. But Vondales and his men had already taken the elk from the Harkonites and muzzled the beast with a belt. The girl's brother, whom Sade was certain was an imbecile now, had turned violent, striking uselessly at the elder Sevwar and warriors. Vondales brushed him aside with a laugh, and the boy was reduced to a rocking, blubbering idiot. His men tightened the ropes and Vondales struck the elk on its face so that it collapsed onto its side. "Shall we carry it to the ship?" Vondales asked him. "Yes, and get the men working on buying some lumber from the islanders. We will need to build a cage." Chapter 25. The Ship of Red Sails. The creak of the back door, the ringing of the fireplace tools on the hearth, the scraping of the kitchen chairs on the wood floor. These familiar sounds crept through the drug-induced fog that enveloped Gabriella's brain. She could smell the hickory wood rafters, the bitterroot tea, the cinnamon her mother used for baking. Her senses told Gabriella she was home. She was, but something was wrong. Doors slammed, the bed creaked with Dameon's rocking, and he counted primes under his breath. Accusatory voices came from the next room. Her mother's, her father's. How could you attack our own people? How could you allow them to give him over to the Sevwar? Don't you know what he was? No, it's not true. Then her parents were silent. The rocking under her bed stopped. So had Dameon's counting. Gabriella knew her brother was standing in the doorway staring at their parents. Dameon, you should be in bed, her mother said. No, wait. Listen to the boy, her father said. Then her brother's voice began to drone on, relaying their story in his own matter-of-fact way. Emotionless, factual, and most importantly, true. Dameon, who was incapable of lying, was telling the story of their quest. Gabriella was helpless to leave her bed as Dameon's voice continued. She could not even open her eyes. The sleeping potion had been strong. She listened to Dameon's voice as he methodically told their story. Then he spoke more quickly, which meant he was excited as Dameon could be. But Gabriella was unable to concentrate on the words. Her eyelids fluttered, feeling like leaden curtains. Her body was limp and unresponsive. Then Dameon stopped. How much time had passed? How much he had been able to explain? Gabriella heard her father's voice. She did not hear her mother, but she knew she was there. Trying to concentrate was too much for her, and Gabriella drifted again aboard the Elan, floating in the night sky. No, she thought. The Elan is gone. But she saw Gade smiling, the halyard in his hand, his foot on the gunwale, the stars hanging about him. Behind him stood a second figure, Brigitte, blue, benevolent, beautiful. Gabriella felt her mother's touch and heard her weeping beside her bed. I'm so sorry, her mother repeated. I'm so sorry. Then she was gone. Gabriella tried to focus and hoped she would not drift back into unconsciousness. Hours slipped by and the room grew colder. Gabriella heard the bedroom door open. Through her haze, she knew Dameon's steps. He climbed the ladder to her bunk. She could imagine him looking at her, staring intently, his rocking and nervous tics fewer now that he was in a familiar environment. But she also could sense his concern, sympathy, love. That had been the gift the Wyvern's mage fire had given her. If Gabriella could have reached out to him, she would have, but her arms were limp. As if he read her thoughts clearly, he touched her hand. It was a brief, perfunctory touch, and he quickly withdrew and descended the ladder, but it spoke volumes to her now. She would have wept if she could have. Instead, she slept. When Gabriella next woke, her limbs were heavy, but she could move them. She sat up slowly, still dizzy from the drugged drink. She steadied herself by holding onto the rafter above her head. She knew the ladder would be difficult to negotiate, but she managed to climb from her bunk by taking a single step at a time, gripping the sides of the ladder so tightly her knuckles turned white. She faltered on the second-to-last rung and dropped down to the floor with a thud. Dameon, sound asleep in his bottom bunk, did not stir. He had certainly slept through worse recently. Gabriella staggered to the bedroom door. Her father, wrapped in his thick outer coat, sat before the hearth in the main room. He had let the fire burn low into a pile of red and yellow embers. Lost in thought, he stared at the glowing ashes. Gabriella was surprised to see that his sword was buckled around his waist. Hello, Pumpkin. He turned to look at her, his soft brown eyes sad. Pa? He dropped his head into his hands and sighed. Can you ever forgive us? For what? Which betrayal would her parents own? For she counted many. Dameon told us everything. We couldn't believe him at first, but he is our son. For all the difficulties with him, we know he does not lie. Her father rubbed his forehead, causing his skin to wrinkle and furrow. What a journey, he said, half to Gabriella, half to the darkness that enveloped them. Gabriella nodded. Her parents had never apologized to her before. It was unexpected, and she felt uncomfortable. Did Dameon tell you about his gift? She said. What gift? Dameon is different. We all know. But he is different in amazing ways, too. Father, he is a genius at arithmetic. She went on to explain the calculations he had performed in the maze, the patterns he had seen on the number table, and how he could count hundreds of coins at a glance. He said nothing about that. Her father ran his hands through his gray-flecked hair. Of course not. It is too ordinary to him to mention. We've always known he was good with numbers, but it goes so much further than that. She was overcome with pride for her brother, the child everyone thought was good for nothing. Her father wiped his eyes. Gabriella, I'm so sorry. This is all my fault. Pa, I know you tried to help Adamantis. Gabriella said the elk's name now, certain that Dameon had already told her parents. Her father gestured to his sword. I tried to go down there again to free him, but there are too many of them. Father, the Sevwar could have killed you. I had to. I have so much to make up for. Pa, I'm not angry. I know you tried. He shook his head. No, there is something else. He reached under his coat to an inner pocket of his tunic, then removed something. He opened his hand. It was Gabriella's whistle broken in two. Her hand went to her breast where she felt her own whistle. Could there have been two? She pulled hers out, the intact whistle gleaming on her palm. Pa, where did you get it? I knew Omanuju as a boy. Remember, I knew Adamantis too. He has a deep voice like thunder in the hills, doesn't he? All Gabriella could do was nod. I remember hearing him speak when I was a small boy. I stumbled upon him and Omanuju in the forest. I could move very quietly through the forest back then. He smiled at the memory. He held up the two pieces of his whistle in his calloused fingers. Omanuju gave me this whistle, told me I must keep the secret, but if I were ever in danger, I was to blow it. I never did. I was called off to sea as a deck boy shortly after. I found that I did not think of him and the elk as much. It was as if a spell had been broken. Maybe it was. I began to think the elk had just been a dream, a childhood fancy, my own imagination run amok, or some trick of ventriloquism on the part of Omanuju. I had been very young after all. I never spoke of Adamantis to anyone. Her father sighed. Decades later, I saw Omanuju, and I avoided him. I was afraid to ask him, afraid to find out that I had been fooled, or worse, afraid that it had been real. The whistle broke many years ago, but I always kept it close. He balled his fist around the whistle pieces and hung his head. What wonders have I squandered? Gabriella put her hand on her father's shoulder. She had never seen him so vulnerable. She felt unmoored, as if she were the parent as she comforted her father. Your mother feels terrible. I feel terrible. That is why I went down to the docks. It occurred to Gabriella that it was still dark outside. The tide would not change until around dawn. Are the Sevwar still there? Yes. Gabriella turned to run into her room. A figure sleeping on a straw mat in the corner caught her eye. It was too small to be her mother. As Gabriella bent down close, she recognized the soft brown hair and the freckled cheeks. Her voice caught in her throat. Eloise? Her father said. I found her outside, waiting by the gate, long after everyone else had left. She's been here nearly every day asking if you've come back. She did not get to see you while you were awake. It was too late for her to walk home alone, so I let her sleep here. Emotions tumbled about within Gabriella. Love, surprise, gratitude, and guilt. She had not even thought of asking Eloise to come with her on the journey. Now Gabriella wished she had at least considered it. She never realized how much she had meant to the girl with the weathered arm. I have more friends than I ever realized. But she had little time to waste. In her room, Gabriella rifled through her drawers to find the darkest clothes she could. She tore off her outer garments. She slipped into black trousers and a blue tunic her mother had bought her for the winter festivals. She returned to the room, pulling one of her mother's black cloaks about her. Like the tunic, it was expensive, but she knew that tonight she could make exception. The cloak was short and would not slow her as she ran. I will come along. I don't want you in harm's way. Her father stood and grabbed his coat from the back of his chair. No, I must do this alone. Before he could protest, Gabriella said, It is not that I do not want your help. It is just that I plan to sneak aboard on the morning lines through the gunwale. She looked at his wide shoulders and broad chest. You are a bit large for that. Aye. He was frustrated, but Gabriella saw no other way. She had everything she needed. She opened the door, then stopped. She was home now. She had just refused her father's help, yet it was still his house. She turned back to him. "What are you looking at me for?" he said. "You are no girl any longer. You don't need your father's permission." She ran back to his arms. "Papa Bear, I've been trying to be a big lass like you've told me all this time." She felt her father's chest heave as he laughed or sobbed or both. "Lass, my foot. You are a young woman now. It has just taken your parents some time to realize it. Hopefully, you will be wiser than we. Now go. Dawn is not far." Gabriella burst out of the door and fled down the road. The stars were still bright, but a feeling in the air told her morning was not long in coming. Animals were beginning to stir in their pens. A rooster called out at the false dawn. A donkey brayed. It was too cold for the thin shirt she wore and such a thin cloak, but it was not long before she was panting hot. Her strides were long and purposeful. She imagined she would be tired, but she was not. She passed houses, each still dark, even as she neared the town. Normally, fishermen might be stirring, but after the previous night, no one must have gone to bed early. She passed Chief Salinger's house, and resentment swelled within her. His house was the last before she reached town. Her footsteps rang out in the narrow cobblestone streets. She paused at the square. The torches had been removed. It was empty and dark, as it ought to have been just before dawn. The shadowy hulk of the Elan was collapsed in the opposite corner. She could tell the trunks of treasures had been removed. She wondered where, but she did not care. Even the whereabouts of Garmer's eyes was unknown to her. She had changed clothes without checking her pockets. This troubled her little. Adamantus was worth more to her than mountains of gems, not because of what Omanuju had said about him, but because he was her friend. All that mattered was setting him free. She glimpsed a movement in the shadows near the wreck. Salinger's men guarded the Elan, but from where they were seated on the cobblestones, their backs to the ruined hull of the airship, it appeared they were trying to catch a few winks. It was the same time of night, near the morning, that she, too, had been caught unawares when the mother wyvern had struck the Elan. Now it was her turn. She decided not to cross the square, especially since more attentive guards might be about. She took side streets to bring her to the harbor's edge. The shadows of waterfront buildings provided cover for her all the way to the wharfs. Two of Salinger's men stood at attention, barring entrance to the dock where the larger ships were moored. Were they there to keep people off the dock, or to keep the Sevwar from coming ashore again? The Sevwar's 3-sail carrack sat in the water beyond the ships of Harkness. The other docks were unguarded. Gabriella crept from the shadow of one building to the next, then darted onto the nearest dock. She realized that it would be too difficult to move quietly on the wooden piers with her boots on. She yanked them off and ran barefoot down the dock's length. This pier and the other older ones had been built closer together, too close to accommodate the larger ships the fishermen now used. The charm of the old docks was that at one point, two were close enough together to jump from one to the other if ships were moored between them. Two ships were. Gabriella leapt the gunwales of the first ship, then the second. She had learned the trick from playing hide-and-seek with other children, when the other children had still played with her, before Dameon made her a pariah. The next dock over was for the largest ships. She could just make out the sinister shape of the Sevwar vessel, the carrack's 3 masts looming against the sky. She would have to swim the rest of the way. She slipped off the dock into the dark water, careful not to splash. The water was frigid, but the urgency of her task kept her fatigue and discomfort at bay. She studied the pilings that supported the piers. Shiny dampness was above the highest waves, which told her the tide was moving out. There was little time. She swam across the channel, stroking under the water. It would take her a bit longer, but it was quieter, with less splashing. Any Sevwar who were on deck would expect an intruder to come from the direction of land, so she headed for the sea end of the dock. She swam beneath the dock, trying not to think about the filth that normally floated about in the harbor during the day. The water lapping against ships, the pilings made noise enough to cover the sound of her strokes. She passed the long hull of the Sevwar's ship. Had she been better prepared, she thought, she could have sabotaged the sailing vessel and rendered it unseaworthy. But she was left with only her present plan. She climbed up the anchor chain of a nearby fishing boat and, crouching, ran across its deck to the dock. Despite her attempts to be quiet, Gabriella made more noise than she liked. Hauling herself up onto the fishing boat left her panting, her arms quivering from her efforts. Entering the Sevwar's ship would require more subtlety, more stealth. Her body shivered with cold or nerves as she hid behind a few barrels stacked on the dock. The guards still paced at the entrance of the pier. They were too far away now to hear her. The deck of the Sevwar's ship looked empty, but Gabriella knew there would at least be a watchman sleeping before the gangway. She ran, keeping out of sight as she dodged behind barrels and the pier's mooring post. The carrack was tied to the next post. She slipped behind it. Now so close, the reality of what she was about to do made her head spin. She massaged her arms and took the thick rope in her hands. She would not give herself time to contemplate things. She threw herself over. Hand over hand, foot over foot, just as she had learned from sailors. She was not as smooth as she had hoped, but she reached the railing of the carrack and stopped, swaying on the rope. Footsteps paused above her head on the deck. A Sevwar guard. She held her breath and hoped she was close enough that the ship blocked her from view. She was aware of the water dripping off her and plunking down into the harbor below. The sound was enough to make the guard stop. Gabriella remained still, but her arms were beginning to burn from the strain of holding her weight. Her chest vibrated with effort. Her face was hidden from the folds of her black clothes. But depending on how close this guard was to the railing, he would see her bare white feet on the rope. The guard moved closer to the railing. Gabriella weighed her options. Should she drop into the water and swim under the ship? She took a deep breath, but was rescued by someone yelling down the dock. The feet above her head shifted. The guard was distracted by a commotion at the dock entrance. He walked quickly to the gangway and disembarked. If he turned around, he would see Gabriella, but his attention was on the ruckus on shore. She took advantage of her opportunity and slipped up through the gunwale. On board, she hid herself between two crates in the center of the deck. Voices from the pier drifted back to her, the sound carrying in the still night air. It was her father. She was sure of it. But his voice was slurred, as if he were drunk. Gabriella had never seen her father take a sip of ale in her life, though. Now he was using words that would have earned her a slap. His exclamations and insults were aimed at Salinger's men. He was creating a diversion for her, she realized, sending him a silent thank you. She should have known he would not have simply stood by and waited passively for her return. She was glad he had not heeded her. The Sevwar guard did not return to his post. Instead, he walked down the dock for a better look at the commotion. Gabriella could hear Salinger's men trying to calm her father, asking him to sleep it off in the chief's office. There was a small cell there for drunks. If they talked him into it, he was too big for them to force him. It would give her a few minutes more to ride through the square with Adamantis. She felt the thick rope coiled beneath her. She wiped her feet on it so that the shimmer of her wet footprints would not be visible in the darkness. Crates of provisions crowding the deck provided her with cover. Cargo was kept towards the stern. She stole across the deck, counting more on speed than hiding. The stern was crowded with barrels and crates, but it was not hard to find the elk's cage among them. Adamantis! The elk stirred in his cage. Gabriella, why have you come? It's dangerous. I can't let them take you. I'm getting you out. Where are the keys? Sade has them, but the cage is not strong. I could break it, but the sound will draw the guard's attention. He's on the dock, she whispered. My father is pretending to be drunk. You have a sliver of time. Then back away. I will break the bars. There was a sound of a sword being drawn out of its sheath. Do it, and I will run through your little mistress here, Adamantis. Gabriella felt a sharp point in her back. Sade's voice froze her. He said the elk's name slowly, savoring each syllable. Gabriella knew she had just unwittingly made her betrayal of Adamantis complete. Move away from the cage, Sade said. She did so slowly. Sade's white teeth flashed in the darkness as he grinned. He kept the point of his sword just at her abdomen, forcing Gabriella backwards until she was pressed against the railing of the ship. Up on top, Sade said. Gabriella climbed and balanced on the gunwale, a prisoner forced to walk the plank. If you harm her, Sevwar, Adamantis hissed. How could I? She has served me well. She brought you right into my hands. Now she has confirmed for me just what you are. Let him go, Gabriella begged. Sade shook his head. You are just a little island barbarian, you know. You have such limited understanding of the world, its powers, its rivalries. No, the elk must die, but not until after we tease all his secrets out of him. Vondales! Vondales, The man with the scars and the tattooed scalp, the man she took for Sade's brother, dropped down from the ringing above and landed silently on the deck. He had been there the whole time listening to her and Adamantis. How can I have been such a fool? Gabriella tried to think fast. Vondales' hands were luminous. He was wearing sterling gauntlets with long blades fastened to the top. They flashed in the lamplight as he unraveled a whip from his belt. Its slack dropped down onto the planking with a heavy thud. The metal studs braided into it, scraping the wood like cat claws. "And the first secret we might start with," Sade continued, "would be where you obtain that airship. We are not pleased when our master's work is turned against our purposes." Adamantis smashed against the bars. He had been right. The cage was poorly made. Gabriella could see gaps opening the frame. Sade raised his voice. "Still yourself, Elk, or I will not spare the girl." Sade turned back to her. "I'm letting you go, but your fate is worse than death, Gabriella. You know you betrayed your friend, and be assured of this. He will die. He must die. It will not be quick. It will not be gentle." Adamantis smashed against the bars again, but they did not give. Vondales raised his arm backward, and the whip hissed through the air. Sade called for other guards as he thrust his sword forward between Gabriella's breast. Gabriella felt as if her breath was sucked out of her, and she fell backwards. She slapped against the harbor surface, and the water closed over her.